Barakatuh.
Assalamu,
Wabrakatuh. Thank you guys for your patience. We apologize sincerely. We're very late, to be honest. MSA does not like to be late when starting its events. We respect people who have their time and their curfew. And from the aspect of ihsan, we should try to be on time on everything. Inshallah, we'll take that feedback moving on forward, and this won't happen again. Other than that, inshallah, there has been a typo in the poster. This topic isn't going to be, I won't talk about it, but it should be the nature of man instead of the nature of a man. I'm not going to discuss further details. I'll let Brother Ahmed, inshallah, start with that. Other than that, we'll let Brother Ahmed start. If you have any other questions, note them down, inshallah. We'll go for around an hour, and it'll be very interactive throughout. And Q&A will open it up all the way until around 7:30. Jazakumullah khair. There will be snacks and drinks afterwards. Okay? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين أما بعد. Thank you all for coming out for this lecture. Before I begin, I'd just like to know, because I see there's a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces, if you could raise your hand if you're a student here at SFU. Okay, and if you're a student at UBC, can you raise your hand? Okay, I guess we have nobody from UBC. Okay, alhamdulillah. The topic of today, the poster was titled "The Nature of a Man." You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward the MSA, but I said the nature of man without the A. And the A makes a huge implication because if you add the A, then it seems that the topic that we will be discussing today is masculinity, which is not what we're discussing today. Rather, what we are discussing is a very important contemporary topic related to what is the nature of insan. What is a human being and what distinguishes a human being from other creatures. And so right now it may seem something quite abstract, but as we will see, if you make a mistake at this level in our definition of what a human being is, the consequences which are affecting our current discourse today on topics related to gender, on topics related to nature versus nurture, and so forth. And so it's a very crucial topic that we will be discussing. This lecture is based on a paper that I wrote titled Quranic Realism and the Incoherence of Gender Fluidity, which I'm happy to share with anybody if they'd like to read it. It's currently being edited and will soon be published, inshallah, in the forthcoming months. And so there's a couple things in here that I would like to refine and so forth. Before I begin, has anybody here studied formal logic before? And by formal logic, I mean syllogistic reasoning and so forth. Okay. It will help me because we'll be going through a lot of formal logic today. And there will be points where things may seem a little bit confusing, but in the end, it will all make sense and it will be very simple. So the title that of my paper is Quranic Realism, which is this idea that what the Quran is stating is real, and it's not an analogy nor is it fake. So the stories that are mentioned in the Quran, as Muslims, we believe that all of these are true stories that occurred at some point in time in history, right? So in philosophy, this is known as realism, as opposed to anti-realism, which we will get to, so forth. Now, does anybody know what the word metaphysics means?
Study of reality.
Give me the literal meaning. Does anybody know what the literal meaning of, what is the literal meaning of physics? What does physics mean, or what does physics pertain to? Can you say that louder? So within the word, we have two words. We have meta and we have physics. right? So physics, as we stated, was?
Study of the physical world. What metaphysics mean? The study of things that are greater than the physical world.
Well, if physics means the physical world, what does meta mean?
I assume greater.
Anybody have any ideas?
The physics of physics.
So meta is a Latin word which means transcending. Transcending. So what metaphysics studies is it studies things that transcend the physical world. So metaphysics studies those things which are not physical, which go above it. And as Husnain said, what was your definition of metaphysics?
Study of reality.
The study of reality is one good definition. The study of reality. So this is a major topic which requires a lot of work, but essentially in every single study that we do, whether it be in engineering, whether it may be in health sciences, history, and so forth, all of those presuppose metaphysics. It is the building block by which we use to establish thoughts and ideas. And the things that metaphysics studies are what's referred to as first principles. So every science that we have requires first principles. These are principles that we use to govern those sciences. Does anybody know of any example of a first principle? For example, in logic, if can something be A and B at the same time? Right? So can Jad be inside the room and can he be outside the room at the exact same time? No. So this is known as the principle of non-contradiction. All of our thoughts, our conversations, our reasoning, our arguments are all presupposed by this idea that a thing cannot be A or B. I mean, a thing is either A or B, but it cannot be both. And when we get to the topic of something like gender, we will see how this has become problematic and how people today really, because they made a mistake at this level, because of a simple proposition such as the principle of non-contradiction, because it is ignored, it leads to a worldview like this. And so the crisis of modern Western philosophy with regard to its perception of gender and sex can be linked to its denial of human nature and neglect of traditional logic, both of which assume a metaphysical worldview that natures do exist. So the big topic that we'll be tackling today, which obviously we can't tackle in one day, can I get like an eraser to erase this? Is the topic of nature versus nurture. Can anybody give a brief explanation about what nature versus nurture is, what this debate is? It's mentioned a lot in our discourse. From any angle, from a psychological angle, from a philosophical angle. What does it mean when we say nature versus nurture?
I'm not sure. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
finish it up. So nature is something that, for example, learn from the environment around you.
Exactly. So if you have a child, would we say that that acting out is based, or I'll give you another example. In the ending of one of the chapters of Malcolm X's autobiography, he says that he said, people always ask me how I became the man that I became. And to answer that question for anybody, you have to understand a person's life experiences, because their life experiences is what shape who they are. And so in that passage, is he referring to nature or is he referring to nurture?
Nurture.
He's referring to nurture. So we believe that there is this concept of nature versus nurture, that there is a nature of a human being that they're born with. In Islam, this is called the fitrah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains that every human being is born with a certain level, with a certain type of morality, with a certain belief in God, and so forth. And so that is what we would call nature. But nurture is what we would call people's life experiences. So the under the umbrella, the big topic of gender today is really related to, is gender all nature or is it nurture? Meaning, is our concept of male and female something which is innate to the human being, or is it something that was created based on social constructs and based on people's experiences? That is what, you know, at the university they will say that gender is completely nurture, that there is nothing innate to the human being. My argument today is the Islamic tradition clearly identifies that there is a nature, and that nature is why we have things like males, females, and so forth, which we will get into. So I will begin just very quickly with a story from the Quran, which I mentioned in our previous lecture, which is the famous story of Adam alayhi salam in the Quran. The story of Adam alayhi salam is the story of the beginning of humanity. And so it is the story of humanity and how humans got to this planet. Interestingly enough, when you look at comparative religion, one of the things you find a lot of similarities in this idea of being a first human being. The idea that in the Islamic, Christian, and Judeo tradition, they refer to this individual as Adam alayhi salam, but in other religions they actually have other names, but you actually have somewhat parallel stories of everything beginning from one human being. And just as an interesting side note, and I will bring it up later, one of the big contemporary issues with religion today is the topic of evolution. And many people will use evolution as a justification that religion is false, because religion says that there was this one human being named Adam alayhi salam, whereas our modern archaeology, our evolutionary biology shows that human beings evolved from other creatures and so forth. What the Quran indicates is that Adam alayhi salam was created by Allah, and there was not this evolutionary process and so forth. When Muslims try to address the topic of evolution, what are some of the ways that Muslims try to refute evolution or to try to reconcile between these differences? What are some of the things that Muslims will say? Muslims will tend to attack the evolutionary biology, and they'll try to look at evidences. But what the Islamic metaphysicians say, which is very interesting, their response is they say that the reason why it's impossible for Adam alayhi salam to come from an ape is because Adam alayhi salam has something that they do not have, and that it was impossible for them to inherit, which is this idea of consciousness, which is this idea of the intellect. Because and it's interesting that all manuals of logic, if you study any manual on logic, whether it be logic from a Christian tradition or logic from an Islamic tradition, they always begin with consciousness and how the intellect is a spiritual phenomenon, right? In modern philosophy today, they call this the hard problem of consciousness. Because if you think right now, where exactly is your intellect? Where exactly is your consciousness? Has anybody ever found consciousness? Is it possible that you can take somebody's brain and you can put it under a microscope and you can identify where consciousness is or where the intellect is? To this day, they haven't found it. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Our response is you will never find it because it's a spiritual entity and it's something which cannot be found through physical means. But going back to evolution, if apes and monkeys do not have the type of intellect that human beings have, how is it then that human beings were able to acquire it? This is the huge problem that evolutionary biology faces, and this is what the Islamic metaphysicians say our response to evolution is. Yeah.
I've heard famous guys, when they attack evolution, they'd say that where is the evidence for a species evolving to another species? They can see the evidence for adaptation, but the evolution from ape to man, we can't find that, which is why they would critique the theory itself.
Yeah, that's a valid theory. But this is going to the root of it, and to metaphysics. And interestingly, in the Islamic sciences, the highest science of all is actually metaphysics, above everything, because it studies reality, it studies God. And so this is how we understand it. So the reason why I mention this is because in the story of Adam alayhi salam, if you look at the battle between Adam alayhi salam and Shaitan, the demon, the whole battle really centers on the consciousness, on intellect, which I'm going to show right now. Because, go ahead.
I just had a question.
Yeah. And if you have any questions, by anytime, feel free to raise your hand.
So basically, we know like across history in the Quran, I'm not sure in the Quran, but like I've heard that humans had other forms, so like they used to be huge and stuff. So is it like humans did change across time, but we didn't evolve? Is that like a solid argument?
So it's a very interesting question. So there is a hadith that says that Adam alayhi salam was created into a size which would equate as to 60 feet. And Muntasir Zaman has written a whole book on this, analyzing that, showing that it can't be a parable. I mean, it can't be a hyperbole, because the Quran uses numbers of 7, 70, and 100 as hyperbole, but that's referring to 60. So it's not a hyperbole. There is a new documentary that's out, which everybody in this room has to watch. At least one episode. It will blow your mind. It's called Ancient Apocalypse. Has anybody seen this? It is a phenomenal. I think it's shattering all of archaeology. The central focus is you have this journalist named Graham Hancock, and he goes around traveling the entire world, looking at all the ancient civilizations. And what he finds is that not only were the ancient civilizations far more superior to us today in terms of their technological growth, but also, and he also finds that there is consensus that the story of Nuh alayhi salam happened. Everywhere he goes to, you find the story of the flood. Even here, if you read the book first, I think UBC published it, it's called First Nations. They state that the First Nations people got here after the great flood happened, and the flood took over the earth. So even the First Nations people here believe in it. So he finds evidence that, but also he finds evidence of large human beings. And what he argues is you have in places like, if you look at the pyramids, right? How were the pyramids made? What are some possible explanations that people say of how the pyramids were made? Aliens, okay. Technology.
Millions of slaves.
Millions of slaves. Now, if those pyramids were made in Europe, they wouldn't have said aliens made it. The only reason they say aliens made it is because they don't want to give credit to the Africans, right? But pyramids are found everywhere in the world with the exception of Europe. You have pyramids in Mexico with the Aztecs. You have pyramids in Indonesia. So what he does is he says, he goes to, for example, Indonesia, and he sees at the top of the highest mountain, there used to be this massive pyramid. And he says, each of the bricks that are needed for the pyramid to be made are way close to 3,000 pounds. And so he concludes that it is likely that the way all of these pyramids were made is they were large human beings. And there are some scholars who said that they have traveled in places like West Africa and they've seen large human body parts. Throughout Islamic history, they found like large body parts which they buried. So I would argue, and that evidence, that documentary, I think everybody should watch at least one episode. It convinces me that human beings were larger. Now, if human beings were smaller, it could also be a possibility. But if you go to Jordan, has anybody been to Petra in Jordan? I know Rashid has. They have these massive buildings. Who was living in those? If you go to Saudi Arabia, they have these massive ones as well, and so forth. And then in the Quran too, in Surah Al-Fajr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد, about Ad, about these people, and so forth. So in the story of Adam alayhi salam, and this is the most foundational story arguably in all of Islam, which is the story of humanity and why God created Adam alayhi salam. Allah told the angels that He will appoint Adam on the earth as a vicegerent, as somebody who will take care of the earth and who will inherit the earth, him and his progeny, meaning us. And the angels responded by saying, they asked Allah, why Allah would appoint a creature that would shed blood on the earth rather than them who are sinless. And some of the scholars said what they're referring to are the jinn who were on the earth before and caused all this bloodshed. And Allah responds to them by telling them that He knows what they don't know. Meaning Allah knows what this creation, Allah knows something about this creation that the angels don't know. What did the angels see when they saw Adam? They saw a physical body. They just saw the physical form. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that there was a gift that was given to Adam that was not given to other creatures, which will make them greater than any other creation. And so Allah says He taught Adam the names of everything. And there's over, I think, 500 interpretations of what exactly this means. But He taught him the names, the properties, and He taught them what's called the universals. Does anybody know what a universal is in philosophy? So this is a very fascinating concept. It'll blow your mind. So, yes, you want to try explaining it?
Yeah, so universal can be seen as, you can look at time in particulars. So for example, a day, you can look at it as a universal as time across existence.
Yeah, you're somewhat there. You're there. But look at this. If I have a cup here, right? You see the cup and you see the shape of a cup. You also see this. This is also a cup. Do we have any other cups? No, that's not good. Anyways, okay, imagine you see a bunch of different cups here. They all have different sizes, they're different colors. What exactly makes all of these things a cup? So what is the similarity between these two things that we call both of these cups? This could be larger and we would still call it a cup. It could be smaller, it could be of a different color. So what the mind does at all times is the mind sees a bunch of different particular things and then it universalizes them all into one thing. So if you think about a tree, how many different types of trees do we have? 10, 15, 20, all different sizes, different colors. But what exactly makes all of those things tree? Why do we call all of them tree? They're all different things. That's a concept that the mind creates. And that is how the mind also creates the concept of male and female. Is the mind sees a bunch of different human beings, but the mind can tell the difference after seeing so many of them that it can then tell the difference between a male and a female. Right? If somebody asks you, how do you know that person's a male or a female? The response could just be, well, I just know it. Well, why is it? It's because the mind has created that concept. That is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, among other things, taught Adam alayhi salam. He taught him the ability to see all of these universals. And so interestingly, what happens then is you have shaitan. And shaitan comes and he sees Adam. And Allah tells him to prostrate to him out of respect. And he says, أَنَا خَيْرٌ minhu, that I am better than him. The reason the scholars say why, amidst a plethora of answers, the reason why the scholars say shaitan thought he was better than him is because he only saw the outward of Adam. And if you look at all of the creations that Allah created, if you look at all the animals, you look at the humans, which species is governing the planet? Humans are governing the planet. But are human beings the strongest? Are human beings the fastest? Are they the wittiest? So why are human beings governing the world? Why is it that a human being who could be, 5 foot tall could be in power over something like a lion? What makes human beings more powerful than any other species? The intellect. The aql that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us is the greatest gift that Allah has given us, and it's the gift that makes us greater than every other creature. So when Shaitan saw Adam alayhi salam, he didn't see the intellect. The only things he saw and what the angels saw is they saw the faculties of anger, the faculties of desire, but not the faculty of intellect, of reason. And for this reason, the angels compared Adam to other creatures. But little did they know that Adam had acquired a gift that, if utilized correctly, would transcend him above all of creation, but could also, if utilized incorrectly, make him the worst of creation. This is the gift of the intellect. And so the scholars say, and if the modern human being understood this concept, it would save them a lot of trouble and a lot of confusion. That if the body is a kingdom, the kingdom should be run by the intellect, not by the desires. And so Imam al-Ghazali, in his Alchemy of Happiness, he mentions that the human body is a kingdom, and the king is the intellect, and the servants are the desires. But he said, if you have a human being or a society where the desires are the king, then you have anarchy, you have chaos. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, have you not seen the one who has taken their own desires as a god? They are only like cattle. No, they are worse than that. So what Allah is saying is that if human beings govern themselves based on their intellect, based on their rationality, they become the greatest of creatures. But if human beings govern themselves based on their desires, based on their passions, like what's happening today, all of what's happening today that you're seeing, all this confusion, this madness, is really because people have elevated their desires over the intellect. They have elevated desires over truth. Yes?
Don't the jinn also have intellect reason?
I'm going to get into that. It's an excellent question. I have it as a footnote here. But what we're seeing today is that people will subject truth in accordance with their desires. And so when you say something, the response many people will have is, well, that's hurting my feelings, or this is the desire that I have. And so the Islamic perspective on desires, and really, it took me like 23 years to figure this out. And when I found this out, it made my life so much simpler, is the idea that just because you have desires doesn't mean you have to act out on them. It's a very simple proposition. Just because you have a desire for something doesn't necessarily mean you're supposed to do that. If a person has a desire to harm others, he should not be harming others. If a person has a desire to engage in a type of illicit sexual intercourse, it doesn't mean that he should just because he has that desire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاهُمْ. That govern yourselves according to the law, the Sharia, and don't follow your desires. Really, it's a very simple proposition. And so when the angels saw Adam, they said, this is going to be a creature that's going to follow his desires. Why not, Allah? Why don't you just appoint us instead? And Allah says, I know something that you don't know. And then Allah tells Adam to explain to the angels what he knows and the names that he learned. And when the angels see that, they become humbled. And they say, Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. That glorified is Allah, the one who has given knowledge of that which we don't have, and so forth. But the question now arises, which I will get to your point, but now, there's that recent documentary, What is a Woman? Right? Where this, who has seen that documentary? There's a recent documentary out titled What is a Woman? Where this conservative individual goes out interviewing, asking people what is a woman and what is a man? Meaning he's trying to get a definition. And so the question that I'm proposing today is, what is a man? What is a woman? But first I'll ask, what is man? And when I mean man, what is insan? How would you define what insan is? You can just shout it out.
Bani Adam.
Bani Adam. Okay, from the position of logic, if we were to define it, what would it be?
A body, a soul, and intellect.
No. Does anybody have an answer? How do we define anything?
Their properties.
By properties? No. If you ever look, most of the time in the dictionary, when they want to define something, there's a specific criteria that the logicians have added. There are two things which go into every single definition. What happened to the... Oh, it's right here. It's what's called the genus and what is called the differentia. If you want to define... So people ask you, what is the definition of a thing? If they ever give you a definition of a thing without a genus or differentia, it's an incorrect definition, or it's an incomplete description, which we'll get into. And this is the reason why we have so many problems. Someone like Karl Marx, someone like Judith Butler. Does anybody know Judith Butler? Judith Butler is the leading theorist on gender on the planet, and she actually lives across the street from me in Berkeley, which is very interesting. So for example, if I said, let's look at the concept of a laptop. Okay, underneath a laptop, what do you have? Let's say something like a MacBook. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And let's say a Microsoft, whatever a Microsoft laptop is. So if we are trying to define something like a MacBook, the genus of a MacBook is what is on top of it in terms of its relationship, right? So what is on top of a MacBook is the concept of laptop, and if you go up further from laptop, what would you get? Computer. If you went a bit higher, what would you get? Processors and so forth, right? So you could keep going higher, but for MacBook, if we wanted to define it, this is what the genus is a laptop. Now, what is the thing that distinguishes a MacBook from any other thing? From any other type of laptop? I don't know, you have to ask the computer science guys. That's not my forte. Let's just say made by Apple. So if we wanted to define MacBook, we would need a genus and a differentia. Genus and differentia. I promise you this will all make sense. Just trust me right now. So the definition of a MacBook, we would say, is it is a laptop made by Apple. That would be an accurate, logical definition of what a MacBook is. Because when we define something, what does define actually mean? When I tell you we need to define something, what does that mean? It means to place limits on a thing so that we have an idea of what it is. This is the most accurate definition you will find in terms of using a genus and a differentia. Okay? Now we will get to the main thing. I hope that made sense. We'll use one more example. If we were to talk about a maple tree, what would the genus of a maple tree be? Tree. And what would the differentia be? There you go. Okay. If we were to talk about, let's say SFU. Let's say SFU is not really a concept. let's say communism. Okay. What is the genus of communism? Ideology. Okay. And what would be the differentia? What is something that communism has in it that nothing else has? Not equality. What's specific about communism that it calls for that other ideologies won't? We could roughly say let's say roughly the abolishment of private property. So does this make sense? Okay. So now when it comes to what is a human, what is the genus of human? Okay, so I heard creation, I heard animal, what else? What is the thing above the human being? I heard something from the side. So somebody actually said the right answer. So the genus, this is extremely important. If you understand this, you'll understand the rest of the lecture. The genus of human, human. The genus of human is animal. Okay, and I'll explain why. The genus of human is an animal, according to the logicians. Now, what else would fall under this? If humans are here, a branch. If the genus of human is an animal, what else has its genus of animal? Ape. Okay. What else? I heard a cat. Somebody say cat. Yes, a cat. What else? Cattle. What else? What else? Okay. Okay, this is good. Now, what distinguishes the human being? What is the differentia of a human being that no other species has? Intellect, but I'm looking for a specific word. Like if we were to define human, we would say it's something animal. What would that word be? Conscious. You guys are close. Close. Starts with sapient is kind of right, but we would say rationality. So the Arabic, if anybody's interested, is the Arabic definition of man is haywan natiq, a rational human being. So if somebody were to ask, what is the definition of human? And when I use man, I'm not referring to masculine, like a male. I'm referring to just humanity. The definition is a rational animal. If there's one thing you're going to take from this entire lecture, take that the definition of a human being is a rational animal. This is what a human being is. Okay? The human being is a rational entity. That is a comprehensive definition of what a human being is. Now, people like Karl Marx, people like Judith Butler reject this definition. Instead, they have their own definition of what man is. And as I mentioned in the beginning, if we make a mistake at the level of first principles at the beginning, it will have huge consequences moving forward. How do you think they would define what a human being is? I'll give you a hint. They affirm that a human being is an animal. But remember back to the topic of nature versus nurture. What does our society say today about nature versus nurture? Largely. Which one do they prefer? Nurture. If you go to any, how many people are studying psychology here? Or just psychology in general? In psychology, it will come up. In gender theory, it will come up. But they will talk about all the theories based on nurture. Even in criminology. Anybody in criminology?
Not my major, but I'm taking courses.
Okay. But they will prefer nurture. And so interestingly, they define a human being as a social animal. So they say a human being is a social animal. Now, what are the implications if we say that the definition of a human being, first of all, what does that mean that a human being is a social animal? Someone from the sister side. What does it mean that a human being is a social animal? Yes. Now push that a little bit further. What also does that mean? Wait, yeah. Exactly. There's another hand up.
Like an animal that is constructed by
Yeah, yeah, both of you are correct. It's this idea that the only thing about a human being is nurture. Everything about a human being is their experiences, like Malcolm X was saying. The experiences is what shape everything, and in reality, there is nothing innate about a human being. There's no nature. So for instance, they will say the reason why boys like trucks and girls like dolls is completely to do with nurture. The idea that a boy is raised and he's told to like colors like blue, the idea that he's told to like trucks is the only reason why. So it's actually a social construct, and also for women. So they will deny this word. So something quite interesting, if you saw that documentary of What is a Woman, is the conservative man was saying to the gender theorists that he was explaining his argument, and the gender theorist responded and he said, you're taking a position that believes that there is a nature to the human being. And he said, yeah, obviously, why wouldn't I? Human beings have this innate disposition. And he said, no, we reject it completely. There's no such thing as a human being. There's no such thing as a male, nor is there such thing as a female. These are solely social constructs. These are things that we have created and so forth. So when they say that man is a social animal, what they mean is there's no such thing as nature. They reject the fitrah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Fitratullahi allati fatara an-nasa alayha, that be upright on the innate disposition that God has made you in. And there's a little bit difference of opinion of what exactly that innate disposition is, but the idea is that every human being is born believing in a higher power. So if you were to read, I don't know if anybody here has read the life of Hayy ibn Yaqdan. So this is a book, this is a story of a man named Hayy ibn Yaqdan. It's a fiction of a man named Hayy ibn Yaqdan, written in about, I think, the 12th century by a Muslim. And it's a story of how you have a boy who is raised on an island with all wolves. There's no human being. And so it's his journey and his interactions with other animals with no human being, but ultimately it leads him to believe in a higher power. What people don't know is that story arguably began the spark for the Enlightenment period. And there's a really good book if you want to read called The Vital Roots of Enlightenment, which shows how all the Enlightenment philosophers took this Muslim story and they began to philosophize and begin many of their ideas of enlightenment. And if you read a book like Born Believers, the author's name is escaping my mind, he clearly shows that children are born with a desire to believe in God. And one of the interesting things he mentions is that when a child reaches about a couple months old, the child begins to make a distinction between things that human beings have created and things that they have not created. So by the age of 1, a child already can look at the moon and the sun and realize that there is something greater than the human beings that have created it. And he argues that that's why when the idea of God is presented to them, they have an inclination towards believing it. And he also shows how parents will take their children from the age of 1 and start explaining to them that there is no such thing as a higher being, nor is there such thing as, and they tell them that evolution is correct. And he shows in the book that the children just don't believe it. That the children laugh at their parents. At the age of 1 or 2, they laugh at their parents because it's so absurd in their mind that human beings could have come from apes and that all of this could have come from nothing. Now, what is the problem? So we have these two definitions of what a human being is. One says human beings are a rational animal. The other one says they're a social animal. If you were to believe, this is what the Islamic understanding is this is the definition of a human being, how would you prove that this definition supersedes this definition? Or if you believe that this definition is more accurate, why would you think so? Did somebody say square opposition? No, I thought I heard it. Yeah.
Other animals also socialize?
Yeah. That's one way to answer it. Yeah, other animals are But they will respond and say, okay, maybe okay, so let's say, okay. Yeah, that's one way you can answer, but that's not the answer. Which one, I'm giving you the answer, which one presupposes the other?
Social presupposes the rational.
Hmm?
Social animal presupposes the rational.
No. The rational animal, sorry, yeah, you're correct. The social animal presupposes rationality. Because without any type of rationality or any type of intellect, you can't be social. If you remove the intellect from a human being, how is he going to be a social animal? This, in logic, this is referred to as a had tam. I don't know if anybody's interested in the Arabic definition. Had tam. This is known as a complete definition. And this one, arguably, you can call it, there's a bit different, but you call it a rasam naqis. Rasam naqis. So for instance, let's say I defined a human being as a creature that laughs, that is social, that walks on 2 feet, that cries, and so forth. Is that what a human being, just generally, is that a description of a human being? Yes. But is that what a human being is? No. The foundation of the human being is the fact that it's rational, that it's a rational animal. So, before I move on, does anybody have any questions on this? Yeah.
So it's kind of a long question, but like, my question relates to how is it that they say humans are a social animal, if they also say that humans learned how to communicate on 3 stages, if I'm not wrong. First, they learned how to communicate information, then gossip, then folklore, if there's something like that. Then they said previously humans used to live in caves, hunt, and all of that. So if humans are a social animal, based on them, why is it that it took some time for them to develop these social capabilities, and they lived across some time without these interactions?
A large thing you have to realize, and this is, I actually have a quote in this book. There's a great book on this. So what the author says is, quote, rejecting metaphysics or the science of first principles as contemporary modern thought tends to do in the name of a subject skepticism has long been the result of a psychological inclination rather than a search for demonstration and objective truth. So a lot of what we are witnessing today in many of these ideologies is not an intellectual pursuit. It's really the idea that we've arrived at our conclusion and now we are going to do whatever we can to make sure we arrive at that through whatever basis. And kufr, some scholars, I'm not saying this is kufr, but scholars say kufr is always filled with contradictions. You'll always find it. So it's a lot of it is we have our conclusion, and let's just see how we can get there, how we can rationalize it.
So basically, a lot of people who talk about evolution, they try to convince us that animals also have a rational or like.
Yeah, just a second.
So
now I'll explain it. I have a long footnote in the paper here about it. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam and the ant and hudhud. The hudhud is the correct one. So one may respond by stating that according to the Quran, animals also have the ability to rationalize and make decisions, such as the bird in the story of Sulaiman. What we are arguing, I'll write this on the board. So there are 2 schools of thought in Islamic, whether you want to call it philosophy or so forth, on this. I always lose this marker over here. There are 2 schools of thought as to, are human beings the only creatures with rationality, or are there other creatures? Actually, I don't want to write this. No. One school of thought, which I'm not on this topic, I'm not really a fan of. They will say that animals don't have any rationality, but in the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put the intellect, the faculty of intellect in the ant, at that moment. And so he was able to communicate. That's one school of thought. That's not the one I adhere to. The other school of thought says that animals have a level of intellect. And I think this is quite clear. I mean, you can see it. There's something that they have there that allows them to make decisions. For most animals, I look at my cat often, and I'm just like, what's he thinking about? Like he'll just be like looking out the window, and I'm like, he's really pondering the biggest questions of existence. But it's clear that animals have instincts, but it's also clear they have some sort of faculty of intellect. So what this school of thought will say is that animals have a type of intellect, but they don't have the specific quality of the intellect why human beings are greater than all of them, which is the idea to philosophize, the idea to ponder, the idea to think very deeply. These are qualities that the human being is the only one that has. So animals may have an ability to build, like ants have built some of these, these remarkable structures, but we are the only creatures that have this ability to deeply ponder. And I would argue that it's clearly true because it's the reason why we are ruling the world. I mean, if a lion had like half the intellect that we had, they would have a greater empire than us. But they don't have that ability to really think. So this is how the scholars respond to this idea of ants and them in the Quran speaking and so forth. And if you look at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there are so many miracles where he had these inanimate creatures speak to him, right? Whether it be trees and stuff. And in the Chinese traditions, they say that the sages love mountains and the mountains love sages. And so when you study a lot of comparative religion, but also Eastern religion, you'll find that they all have this idea of moments where these inanimate creatures speak, which is very interesting because it's not scientific, but why is it that all of these different religions are all saying the same thing, that there is something? The Prophet ﷺ said about Mount Uhud that أحبني that he said that I love the mountain and the mountain loves me, and so forth. So that's how scholars reconcile between the idea of, we are still saying that the human being, the foundation is that he has rationality. And rationality does not necessarily mean intellect. So animals can have some type of reasoning, but they are still not a rational animal. A rational animal governs themselves through the intellect. And so that's how they that's how they respond to that. Yeah.
So, like, where would you classify the fact that humans, like, we have art, kind of like we do rituals, we do all these things. Before we have like knives and a spoon. You don't see any animals kind of do any of those sort of things. Like magic?
Like
art, like they don't really paint anything.
Yeah.
Like build, they don't. Like there's just that kind of difference you see within humans and animals. Is that kind of related to rationality in a sense? Like, religion as well. I don't know. That's measurable.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean, it's very clearly, how many people here have pets? Raise your hand. It's got to be more. I mean, if you just look at your pet, and you can clearly tell the difference between the two. I was in Malaysia several years ago, and I was inside this cave that was surprisingly, it's one of the largest pilgrimage sites in the world because there's a Hindu temple at the top. So I think like every year there's like 100,000 people that go in there. So it's very high in the mountains, and they have all these apes and monkeys there. Like you can just see them, and they interact. They walk beside you. And there was this ape that came, and he kind of grabbed my pants. And I looked at it, and he was asking for food. And I literally just looked at it, and I was like, there's no way this could have been my ancestor. Yeah. Wallahi, I literally looked, and I said, Ajib. Like, there's nothing between us, right? And then some people will say, okay, human beings share 90% or 95% of the same DNA as apes. Well, human beings share 90% of the same DNA as a fly. And as some scholars have said, if all of us are made, if human beings, if apes, if everything is created from dirt, right? Like Allah says in the Quran that human beings are made from dirt, then obviously we would have the same a high number of percentages. And one rabbi said, I don't know how accurate this is, right? You can go check his science. He was saying that there's about an 80% similarity in genes between a human being and a watermelon. I don't know how accurate it is, but yeah. So a lot of what I'm getting at here is a lot of these things you can just tell. Why? Because we have a human nature. Some people will say some certain things, and you're like, that just makes no sense. Especially if you're in philosophy, people will say the most absurd of things, and you're just like, that makes no sense at all, and you don't even really need an argument, and so forth. So in animals, a bit too far up. So if the genus is animal, is human. If we were to put what goes under the category of human? There, okay. So Rashid, what did you say?
Man, woman.
Okay. So now, what is the differential between the two? Exactly. And so, what are those chromosomes? It's XY chromosomes, I believe, right? I'm not a science guy. It's X. It's XY. And also, so then, how would you define a woman? I would define a woman. Actually, let me just use this. Not me, but I got this from some logicians. Is that a woman is? It's going to be shocking. A woman is an adult female. Yes.
Well, they might get into details about what is male and then what is female.
Yeah.
So then how do we?
So what do they say? And we're speaking academically here. It's not polemical. But what will contemporary people say about what is male and female? They will say that male and female are social constructs. What does that mean that they're social constructs? They're socially created. There's no such thing as male. There's no such thing as female. These are things that are all nurture, and they're not nature, that human beings have created. And some will say men created in order to subject woman. That's what some of them will say. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Forgot my train of thought.
How could men created to subject women if men and women are subjective, though?
Yeah. I mean, look, like I told you, there's a billion ways you can answer many of these questions. Yes.
The XY, XX chromosomes, that's not nurture. That's like a biological fact.
Yeah, but many of them today reject biology. Right? And they will make, this is like, how many of you here are in social sciences? I was expecting more. Yeah, if you're in the social sciences, they were teaching me this in my history class here. Like do you guys know about the gingerbread man? They have this idea of a gingerbread man and how the gingerbread identifies as something else, and so it's not actually like a male and so forth. But the main thing, just take away, is that the definition of a human being is a rational animal, and that it is our rationality that governs us. We are not. So there is an element of sociality. The human beings are social animals. But when we say that a human being is a social animal, we're not saying that is the ultimate definition of what a human being is. We're merely identifying an aspect of them. So Aristotle said that human being is a political animal. He didn't mean that the thing that distinguishes humans from all other creatures is that they are political, but rather that is an aspect. So we're not denying nurture. Most of our experiences, most of who we are is based on our nurture, not our nature. But the foundation of who we are is largely, some would say, our nature, right? The idea that there is something about a human being that distinguishes them from other creatures and so forth. And that thing that distinguishes human beings from other creatures is Rationality. Oh my God. We just spent like 2 hours on this. Yes.
So then, if we have males and females with that biological definition, where do other chromosomal formations come when we talk about Islam?
Are you talking about like intersex people?
Yeah. So do we have all of them under one category, or would we have several categories with that as well?
So in the books on Islamic law, they'll have sections on like Babul Khantha, right? The chapter on hermaphrodites. And an interesting thing is, today they talk about, and I'm being purely academic here, and anybody can challenge me, but they talk about, when they talk about transgenders today, right, in this society, it's different than what we have in our mind for intersex. So if you're, for example, from Pakistan, and you've been, I'm not too familiar with many of the other countries, but if you've been to Pakistan, you can see the hermaphrodites, right? You see them. They exist and they're real, but they're born like that. Here, when they talk about transgenders, they're talking about something completely different. They're talking about people alternating, moving between genders. So just immediately, we have to make that distinction. Intersex and transgender are completely different. The book of fiqh, the books on Islamic law talk about hermaphrodites. And they still put them into the category of males and females, but they have specific criterias, which I don't know if it's kind of appropriate to say now. But largely, it goes around the hermaphrodites' genitals and which area they urine through. And through that, they determine whether this is male or female. So they are still male or females, but they're in a little bit of a slight different category. But they exist, and our books talked about them. The fiqh books even talk about where they should stand in salah, how much inheritance they get, who can marry them, and so forth. So they existed, right? But don't make that conflation, because here that's what they'll do. They'll say, oh, hermaphrodites exist, therefore they're transgenders. No, they're different things. These are people who are born with specific private parts, and these are people who are transitioning. So they're different. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm not too sure if this is related, but I'm just curious to know if animals are souls or spirits.
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder?
Animals are soul or spirit, like a spiritual thing that's tied to them.
In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the Quran or in the Hadith, I'm pretty sure it's in the Quran, explains that everything that exists is in worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything. And so with that basis, we would say whether or not they have a soul, they have something, right? So for instance, there is a hadith that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I think it was related to like Kitabul Fitan, like near the end of times, where it will say that one person will be killing another. No, I know the specific hadith. It talks about people killing each other, and then it talks about how even rocks will testify that there's a person behind me, and so forth. And the hadith in At-Tirmidhi says that it says that even fish ask for forgiveness for human beings. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the birds, talks about the Arabic is just escaping my mind right now. But Allah says all of creation is worshipping Allah. Everything. In Surah Rahman, وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ, that the stars and the trees prostrate to Allah. So animals do have spirits. So this is something interesting. In modern day religious studies, when they explain the religion of the indigenous people of this land, what do they say about them? What do they say about like the indigenous people here, their religion? What do they say they worship? Spirits. That is a construct that they have created, the Orientalist has created. What they do is they created this narrative that when the first human beings came, they began to create, I'm missing up between what was the first and second, but they used to basically worship idols, right? They used to worship idols, and then what they did is they took those idols out and they put it into inanimate creatures and they began worshiping the creatures. And then after that, they say it's because of Ibrahim alayhi salam. We would reject it. They say Ibrahim alayhi salam came and he said, no, let's take the spirits outside of these entities and let's put them in one God. And they say that's how monotheism was created. So they say monotheism is a social construct. It doesn't actually exist. Then they say from Ibrahim you get the Judaism, and then you get Christianity, and you get Islam, and then these religions conquered the world and they spread monotheism everywhere, which is something we completely reject, because we believe that every single civilization, that their basis was monotheism, because Allah sent prophets everywhere. And so when you do an analysis of comparative religion, the narrative that I've just said is what they teach you here. But if you really study it, and this is what my thesis currently focuses on, is you find that monotheism in every single culture was the norm. And then polytheism emerges. And the clearest indication of that in the Quran is the story of Musa alayhi salam. Because Musa alayhi salam is one of the greatest prophets ever sent, and his people are worshipping Allah, but he goes on a 40-day hiatus, and when he comes back, they're worshipping idols right away. So if you want to study the religion of ancient Egypt, it's exactly what happened in ancient Egypt. You can read about someone like Akhenaten. Has anybody heard of Akhenaten? Akhenaten was an ancient Egyptian who was a ruler of Egypt, and essentially he was a polytheist, or that's what they claim. But one day he said he had revelation come to him, and immediately he destroyed all the idols in Egypt and he turned it all monotheistic. Right? They will say, we don't know why he had an impulse to do that. I would respond that maybe he received revelation from God and he was clearing out the idols. If you study Confucianism, if you study Taoism, even if you study Hinduism, I mean, it's a longer conversation, the basis of all of these are monotheism and so forth. So what they do is they take this, they've created this narrative that indigenous people worship these trees and entities. I would argue and say no, they actually didn't. There's just a misunderstanding of what there is. They saw in nature that nature was a divine gift that Allah gave us, and they saw the mystical elements within it, but the academics will say this is them worshiping it. I would say no. Does anybody have any other questions before I kind of wrap up? And then I want to open it up for Q&A. The last thing I will mention, this is the conclusion of the paper, is that in our contemporary age, when ideologues reign supreme in influence, where new genders are manufactured every passing moment, when human nature has been buried and replaced with nurture, and when anti-realism becomes the predominant metaphysical school, the study of logic underpinned by metaphysics becomes more crucial every day. And this is the last thing I will mention. We have this idea of truth. In today's society, they will say, live out your truth. They will say, who are you to impose your truth on other people? What exactly do they mean when they say that?
They don't believe there's one truth, like they don't believe in reality in a sense.
They don't believe that there is objective truth. And so what they will say, especially what they will say to Muslims, is they will say, you live out your truth and your religion is true to you, but you are not allowed to impose your truth on others, as if there are multiple truths. So in Islam, we believe that truth is what's called, truth is objective, and that it is, there's JTB just right. Truth, this is the definition of truth, but I don't think this is a logic definition, so ignore it for now. Truth is what corresponds to reality. Truth is not some, where does truth exist? Does truth exist in the mind, or does it exist in the external world? Where does truth exist? Is it in the mind or is it in the world? It's in the world.
Yeah, we use the mind to look at the
But yeah, we use the mind to understand truth, but truth is what is in reality, right? So what the subjectivist will say is, no, truth is in the mind. But what's the problem if truth is in the mind? It's subjective, because in my mind I can have one understanding of truth and another person can have another. But as Muslims, we believe that there's objective truth. And in the Aqidah manuals, they begin by saying, they state this, that قَالَ أَهْلُ الْحَقِّ, that the people of truth say, حَقَائِقُ الْأَشْيَاءَ ثَابِتَةٌ, that the reality of things are established, and that the sophists don't have knowledge of it. So what do they say? They say, these are the two camps they identify. And one thing you'll realize if you study enough philosophy is there's no real such thing as a new idea. It almost never exists. Almost all of the new ideas that you're seeing being created, whether it's by Michel Foucault, whether it's by Karl Marx, whether it's by Derrida, all of them you'll find the foundations in Greek philosophy and the Greek philosophers. So you have two camps. You have the camp of the people of truth, and you have the sophists. What do the people of truth believe about truth? It's objective. And then what do the sophists believe? It is subjective. Today, who believes that truth is objective? Muslims amongst other groups. And who believes that truth is subjective? Certain individuals in the West, we can say. These are the two camps identified over 1,000 years ago, because human nature does not change. As much as people want to talk about progress and change, human nature does not change. And that's why every single empire that ever collapses, they always collapse for the same reasons. Always. If human beings were progressing and there was something new about us, there'd be another reason as to why we collapse. Or maybe we wouldn't collapse. But the same thing happens over and over again. If you spend time, and I would recommend this, spending time reading Eastern philosophy or the classic Islamic books on psychology, right? And what is the Islamic, in Islam, what do they call psychology in Arabic? Rashid said it. It's called the ilm an-nafs. What does this mean? The science of the self. What does psychology literally mean? There are two words in here. We have psych and ology. What does ology mean, roughly? The study of. And what does psyche mean? Soul. So think about this. If psychology means the study of the soul, the first principle is that you believe that there's a soul. How can you do psychology if you don't believe that there's such thing as a soul? And so what they're finding now, if you look at many of the greatest Islamic psychologists today, all of them are just citing the work of the people of the past, the great scholars, because the idea is, and this is what the Quran talks about, is that the self does not change. If the self changed, then we could say the Quran is irrelevant in our life. A'udhu billah. Because it's only applicable to the people of the past. It's not applicable to us. But the Quran is applicable to all human beings because the self does not change. How do we get here?
Mind or physical world.
Yes. So the people of truth, their truth is objective, whereas the sophists, and the sophists always believe their ideas are new. But, and I know some of you know the answer to this, so you can't say it. What did Karl Marx do his PhD in? It'd be interesting, right? What did he do his PhD in? Because that clearly would tell a lot about his positions. He did his PhD in Greek materialism, right? Greek materialism. That's the school of approach that he took. And so if you're ever wondering why Muslims fell in love largely, not completely, with Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, is because ancient Greek had two camps. You had Ahlul Haqq and you had the sophists. The sophists were the Greek materialists, and the people of Ahlul Haqq, right? The people who believed in objective truth were Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, largely. And so all we're seeing today is the people who take the approach of Greek materialists read the Greek materialists, and the people who believe in objective truth always read Aristotle, which is why Aristotle had a huge impact on Muslim thought. And in the Islamic books on theology, many of them will say that in regards to Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, that either they were prophets or they were students of prophets. This is what the books on theology argue, because almost everything that they're saying is compatible with Islam. Almost, not everything. So my point being is, we're never living in a new age. And if you read philosophy from hundreds of years ago, you'll see everybody is in two camps, largely, and so forth. So in conclusion, before we just open up the floor, what is the definition of a human being? Human beings are? Human beings are? And what do the materialists define? How do the materialists define a human being? What is the problem with that definition? Okay, but it presupposes rationality. And what distinguishes the intellect or the rationality of humans with animals? I mean, humans with apes, monkeys, or other things? What distinguishes from a human from an ape? The idea to deeply ponder. The idea to deeply ponder. Because some people will use this as an argument and so forth. So I'll conclude with that, and if there's any questions, we can open up the floor. Otherwise, feel free to approach me. But Jazakallah khair. Haider, bismillah.
So there is a story in the Quran where Allah punishes a nation by turning them into monkeys. Do you think that played some sort of role into modern scientists believing like we come from monkeys? Was that some way related to modern evolution?
So we actually had this debate last week. I had it with some of my friends. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the Jews. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about them following the Sabbath, which is their Jum'ah basically. Right? The Sabbath is their day, and they were commanded that on the Sabbath they could not work. That it was a day of worship and it was a day of rest. Right? What some of the Jews did is they said, okay, we're not going to work on Friday, but what we'll do is on Thursday night, we will put out our nets for fishing, and we'll leave it there. And they will catch a bunch of fish, and then on Saturday when we come back, we'll have a bunch of fish. So we technically didn't work, right? So they tried to cheat the rule. And the punishment that was given to them, Allah says in the Quran, is that they were turned into apes. Some people have used that as an argument of evolution. The problem with that approach is that the two positions about that story is either immediately they were turned back to human beings, or they died and they didn't have any offspring. So either way, there was no, that even if they survived, the lineage ended there. The lineage could not have continued. So I think that's Surah Al-Baqarah, if you want to look at that. Anybody have another question? Did you guys feel that the material was a bit complex? Okay. Yes. There was one other thing I really wanted to mention. This is important. There is an excellent book I haven't read cover to cover. It's called Farewell to Reality. And it's a book written by a popular, he's kind of like a journalist, but it's a very strong critique to modern physics today. And essentially what he says in that book is that physics today has become a fairy tale, and it has become magic. It has become superstition. And what he means by that is he's saying that physics now is coming up with ideas like multiverse. Does everybody know what is multiverse theory?
A lot of universes that would coexist.
Say it a bit louder.
A lot of universes, like variations of them, exist at the
same time.
Yeah. So multiverse is this idea that we live in this universe, but there is there's a plethora of other universes that we are all in, and that there are different versions of us in all of them. So he explains why that is problematic. He explains like string theory and so forth. But the main point I want to highlight about the book is what he says is that physicists need to understand that they need to demarcate their lines about what things they can speak on and what things they cannot speak on, or at least things that they are trained to speak on and things that they're not trained to speak on. So he said physicists need to learn their boundaries and not to speak on metaphysics. The topic of God is a topic of metaphysics. It's not a topic of physics. So when the physicists, right, if you look at many of these new atheists, Stephen Hawking, Christopher Hitchens, and so forth, they're speaking as philosophers, but they're acting like they're physicists. So one time at SFU, I was taking a class on the philosophy of science, and my professor said that Stephen Hawking is regarded as, this brilliant, remarkable thinker, and he was remarkable, speaking about God, but he had no training in metaphysics, so he just sounded like an absolute fool when he was speaking. So every society has a priestly class. Every single society has a religious class. Who are the priests in our society today? In this society, who are the priests that we go to for answers to the biggest questions of life? The scientists. Specifically who? No, specifically amongst the scientist group. Which group of people, which science are the ones who we ask about, explain to us God or the universe? The physicists. The physicists and the scientists have become the religious class. They are the ones who give the fatwa. That's largely what it is. They give the fatwa as to whether or not God exists, whether or not, the creation of this universe. But what they fail to realize is they're speaking on metaphysics. They can only understand the physical world. They can't understand what is beyond the physical world. What's the name of the science that studies beyond the physical world? Metaphysics, right? So when they say that, when they talk about, for example, the Big Bang theory, that that there was this Big Bang that happened, and that before it there was all these things coming together, well, you can't speak on that because that is an immaterial reality, right? You can't speak on God because God is not a physical entity. If you try looking for God, you won't find him. And in the Quran, it's either the story of Fir'aun or the story of Nimrud, of one of the two tyrants, I think it was Fir'aun, one of the two, who asked to build that long building. It was Nimrud, right? And what did he say he wanted to do with that building? He wanted to see God. But you can't see God. Meaning you can't build a tower and think you're going to see God. And the more that NASA is doing all these studies and figuring out how big the universe is, the more they're realizing how little they know. And this is what, interestingly, my teacher in my philosophy of science class said there's the idea of exoplanets. You know what exoplanet is? An exoplanet is a planet outside our solar system. In 1998 was the first time they had evidence that there were other solar systems that existed. Before 1998, they had no evidence and they didn't know. But Imam al-Razi in his tafsir on Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, he says, all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. And he says there are thousands upon thousands of worlds that exist out there. And he said this 800 years ago to something that we now have evidence of. And the Prophet ﷺ gave the analogy of the ring in the desert. Each of the heavens, the first heaven being the ring in the desert, and the second one being the next, and so forth. So we take our idea from metaphysicians, from our scholars. Everybody needs to learn to stay in their lane when they speak. But you can speak on whatever you want, just make sure you understand it and you have the correct methodology, and so forth. Any last questions? Yeah.
So the idea that you talk about nature versus nurture of human being, takeaway for us, how should we proceed forward with our lives regarding to what our nature is and nurture is?
The topic of nature and nurture is massive. It is so massive. And this lecture could have gone so many different ways. The way I targeted it, from what the logicians say is the most important way, is understanding what exactly a human being is. And if the only thing you took from this lecture, really, if the only thing you took is that the definition of a human being is a rational animal and not a social animal, and you know the reason why, you have walked away knowing everything you need. Everything else was just definitions and so forth. And the reason, our scholars say in that book on first principles, he said, historically, you would not need to study any of this. You would not need to know what a definition, a logical definition is and so forth. But because we live in a society where every single day they are changing and redefining things, it's important and it's crucial that Muslims need to understand the bare minimum. Truth is objective. It exists in reality, not in the mind, and there's one truth, objectively. People have their own subjective experiences, that's fine, but there is one truth. So this whole lecture could have been condensed in 30 seconds, to be honest. But we decided to take the long way and so forth. And just in closing, what I will mention is that, I spent 5 years at this university. I spent a lot of time at the University of Berkeley. I spent some time at Stanford University. Our biggest scholars will say we see where these ideas are going. And a very important, crucial lesson our scholars always tell us, with any idea, whatever idea it may be that anybody adopts, always push it to its logical consequence. Always push it to the ending. The problem of this culture is they take an idea, they adopt it, but they don't push it to its logical consequence. But if you were to push it to its ending, you will find how absurd it is and how false it is. So for instance, in this culture, if you ask people, how do you determine your morality? What will they say? Based on harm. The harm principle. They will say, as long as you are not harming anybody, the action is correct. And so if you respond, they haven't thought out what the logical consequences of that is. But if you ask them, well, is there anything wrong with incest? If there's a parent and a daughter and they're consenting, is there anything wrong with that? They haven't thought it out, and immediately there's a cognitive dissonance where they get shocked. But as we've seen here with the MSA, unfortunately, they end up believing it because they see where the logical consequences. And then you can push that even further. What's wrong with pedophilia if both of them are consenting and there's no harm? Well, they will say there's nothing wrong with it. And I guarantee you, this is not my argument. If you've been reading enough about Western philosophy and the trajectory it's going right now, the legalization of incest and pedophilia is very close. They have their lobby groups in every country, including Canada. Canada is one of the most progressive countries. I went to Berkeley and I thought, Berkeley is probably the most progressive place on the planet. And they said, you haven't seen Vancouver. I'm like, tell me about it. Because a lot of these ideas now are on the West Coast are originating. And if you go on TED Talks, you can find many lectures saying, what is wrong with pedophilia? What is wrong with incest? But the fundamental problem is people are adopting ideas that they're not pushing to their logical consequence. So even us as Muslims, if we take things to their logical consequence, if we were to believe that the definition of a human being is that human being is a social animal, well, let's push that to its logical definition, which would ultimately mean there's no such thing as nature. And if there's no such thing as nature, there's really no real essential difference between a male and a female. They're the exact same. And if they're the exact same, then we can just recraft these individuals. We can change their identities through surgeries, and this could be a male, this could be a female, and so forth. So always push ideas to their logical consequence and so forth. Jazakum Allah khairan. Sorry for taking up a little bit more time. I'm here if anybody wants to ask any additional questions and so forth. We'll end with a dua. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu Alaykum wa Rahmatullahi wa Barakatuh.